She wasn't supposed to be in that room. She wasn't supposed to be in that house at all. But hunger has a way of making you brave, or maybe just desperate enough to stop caring about the difference. And on the night that changed everything, Delilah Carter was both. The Mercer estate sat on the edge of Greenwich, Connecticut, like a secret the rest of the world wasn't allowed to know. Iron gates, security cameras, men who stood too still and watched too carefully. It was the kind of place that swallowed people whole and never apologized for it. And Delilah, 22 years old with worn sneakers and a scholarship she was 3 weeks from losing, had no business being anywhere near it. But her mother was inside. Her mother was always inside. Grace Carter had cleaned those marble floors for 4 years without complaint. For years of bleaching countertops, pressing dress shirts, and disappearing into the background like a woman who had learned that invisibility was its own kind of armor. She sent money home every Friday. She never asked for anything extra. She never spoke about the man who owned the house. Not his temperament, not his moods, not the rumors that followed his name like smoke follows fire. His name was Elias Mercer, and every single person in Greenwich, Connecticut knew to say it quietly. Delilah hadn't planned to come, but when her mother stopped answering her phone for 3 days straight, when the last text read, "Don't worry, baby, I'm fine," in the exact tone people use when they are absolutely not fine, she came anyway. She took the last bus from New Haven, walked 14 minutes in the rain, and slipped through a side gate that a distracted guard had left unlatched. She found the kitchen empty. She found her mother's coat hanging on the back of a chair, keys still in the pocket. She found a half-eaten meal on the counter going cold. And then she heard it, a voice, low and controlled, coming from the hallway just beyond the kitchen door. A voice that made the air in the room feel thinner. She should have left. Every sensible part of her brain was screaming at her to leave. Instead, she pressed her back against the wall and held her breath. The kitchen door swung open. He filled the doorway the way storms fill the sky, completely, without warning, leaving no room for anything else. Elias Mercer was taller than she'd imagined, broader. He wore a dark suit with no tie, collar open at the throat, and he moved with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. He was maybe 35, with sharp features, dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and a jaw set like he'd made a decision about every person he'd ever met within the first 10 seconds of meeting them. Those eyes landed on Delilah. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She lifted her chin, not because she was brave, but because her mother had raised her to stand up straight, even when her knees were shaking. Especially then. "I'm looking for my mother," she said. "Grace Carter. She works for you." Elias didn't move. He studied her the way a man studies something unexpected, not with anger, not with warmth, but with the slow, careful attention of someone recalibrating. Then he said 4 words that she didn't expect. "I know who you are." Her heart stopped. "She talks about you," he said simply. "The daughter at Yale. Pre-law." A pause so brief, she almost missed it. "You look like her." Delilah didn't know what she'd expected. Anger, maybe. Security called, escorted out into the rain like a mistake that needed correcting. She had not expected him to know her name before she gave it. She had not expected the way his voice softened, just barely, just enough, on the word "her." "Where is she?" Delilah asked. Elias looked at her for one long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the hallway. "Come with me." She shouldn't have followed him. Every rule her mother had ever taught her said, don't follow powerful men into dark hallways. But something in his face, not kindness exactly, something more complicated than kindness, made her feet move before her mind could argue. She didn't know yet that following him would unravel everything. She didn't know that by morning, nothing about her carefully ordered life would look the same. And she had absolutely no idea that the most dangerous thing waiting for her in that hallway wasn't a threat. It was him. Grace Carter was sitting up in a bed on the third floor, wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than Delilah's monthly rent, with an 4-line running in her left arm and a private nurse seated quietly in the corner. She looked small in a way that frightened Delilah deeply. Not frail, but compressed, like a woman who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally, quietly, set it down. Manga. The word came out broken. Grace looked up, and the expression that crossed her face moved through surprise, relief, and guilt so fast it was almost impossible to track. "Baby, I told you not to come." Her voice was rough but steady. "I told you I was fine. You stopped answering your phone for 3 days. I dropped it. Cracked the screen. I was going to call you from—" Grace stopped. Her eyes moved past Delilah to the doorway, where Elias still stood. Something passed between them. Not words, just a look, the kind of look shared between people who have reached an understanding that doesn't require explanation. "Thank you," Grace said to him quietly, "for calling her." Delilah turned. "You called me?" Elias met her eyes with the same unreadable expression he'd worn since the kitchen. "Your number was in her phone. She asked me not to worry you." A beat. I disagreed. Delilah stood very still, processing that. This man whose name people said quietly, whose house had gates and guards and a reputation that preceded him by miles, had looked at her mother's cracked phone screen, found her number, and decided on his own that she deserved to know. Without being asked, without any reason to. She didn't know what to do with that. The nurse excused herself, and for a moment the three of them existed in the strange, suspended quiet of a room where everyone was being careful. Grace patted the edge of the bed. Delilah sat. She took her mother's hand and held it and didn't say anything for a while, because some moments don't need words. They just need presence. Elias moved to leave. And that's when Grace said the thing that changed the atmosphere of the entire room. "She's been working 2 extra jobs," Grace said, not to Delilah, to him, "to keep me from worrying. She thinks I don't know." "Mama." 3 jobs, Elias. Grace's voice was quiet but deliberate. "My daughter is running herself into the ground at 22 years old because she's trying to take care of me and finish law school at the same time, and she won't ask anyone for help because I raised her exactly the way I was raised, which was wrong." The room went very still. Delilah felt heat crawl up her neck. Being known that completely in front of a stranger felt like being turned inside out. "I'm fine," she said, which was the same thing her mother had said 3 days ago and was equally unconvincing. She felt him looking at her before she turned. When she did, something in his expression had shifted, barely visible, but there. Not pity. She would have bristled at pity. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. He left without another word. But at the doorway, he paused, just for a second, and she had the distinct, unsettling feeling that he was filing something away. Something about her specifically. She didn't know why that made her pulse unsteady. Grace squeezed her hand. "He's not what people say he is," she murmured. "What do people say?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "That he's cold. That he doesn't care about anyone." A pause. "He sat with me for 2 hours waiting for the doctor. He didn't say much, but he stayed." Delilah looked at the empty doorway. She thought about a man who called a daughter he'd never met because he disagreed with leaving her uninformed, who stayed 2 hours in silence because a woman who cleaned his house was sick and alone, who looked at Delilah like he was solving something. She thought, dangerous. She thought, stay away from him. She thought both of those things clearly and completely. And then she went downstairs to thank him, because her mother had raised her right, even if the raising had been complicated. And when she found him alone in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee already poured, one clearly waiting for her, she sat down across from him and told herself this was nothing. It was not nothing. They talked for 2 hours. She never touched the coffee. She barely noticed. She stayed the night. Not because he asked, he didn't. Not because it was comfortable, it wasn't exactly. But because her mother's condition had worsened by midnight, a low fever the nurse wanted to monitor, and there were no more buses back to New Haven, and the rain had not stopped, and Elias Mercer had said, simply and without ceremony, the East guest room is made up, and walked away before she could argue. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay in a bed with sheets that smelled like cedar and clean linen, staring at a ceiling that was far too high above her, and thought about the conversation in the kitchen, about how easily he'd listened, about the way he'd asked questions, not many, but precise, like a man who understood that the right question was worth more than a dozen wrong ones. About the moment she'd said something sharp and funny without thinking, and the corner of his mouth had moved, barely, just barely, in a way that felt like winning something. She thought, stop it, Delilah. By 6 a.m, she was dressed and downstairs, intending to check on her mother, drink bad coffee from a gas station somehow, and construct a dignified exit. Instead, she walked into the kitchen and found Elias already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she entered. He said nothing. He pointed to the coffee maker. She poured herself a cup and sat down, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and that was exactly what frightened her. "How's the scholarship?" he asked, not looking up from his phone. She paused. "My mother told you about that too? She talks about you constantly." Still not looking up. "The scholarship, the internship you turned down in August, the professor who keeps trying to recruit you for his research team." Now he looked up. "Why did you turn down the internship?" Nobody had asked her that. Not directly. Her advisor had made disappointed noises. Her study group had called it brave and clearly meant reckless. But nobody had looked at her across a kitchen table at 6 a.m. and just asked. Like the answer mattered. Like she mattered enough to have a real reason. Because it was in California, she said carefully. Asterisk, and my mother was here. And the pay was deferred, and I couldn't afford. Asterisk, she stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," he said simply. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. That was the problem. It should have been. She was 22 and black and broke, and sitting in a mansion kitchen, talking to a man whose world operated on entirely different rules than hers. There should have been friction, distance, the natural awkwardness of two people with nothing in common pretending otherwise. Instead, it felt like a conversation that had been interrupted a long time ago and was only now continuing. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and stood. "I have to take this." He was already moving toward the hallway. Then he stopped with his back to her and said, without turning around, "Don't leave without telling me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an order. It landed somewhere in between, in a register she didn't have a clean name for. She stared at his back. He disappeared around the corner. She sat with her coffee and her pulse and the quiet understanding that she was in a great deal of trouble. Not the dangerous kind. Not the kind her mother had always warned her about powerful men in expensive houses. A different kind. The kind where you start noticing things. The way someone holds their coffee cup. The particular silence they bring into a room. The way they say it matters like they mean it all the way down. Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway an hour later, color better, fever gone, wrapped in a robe, and looking at Delilah with a specific knowing expression that mothers manufacture somewhere around their child's 18th birthday. "Don't," Delilah said. Grace sat down and said nothing, but she was smiling, and that smile said everything. She went back to New Haven. Of course she did. She had classes and a thesis outline and a life that existed entirely outside those iron gates. And she was not the kind of woman who lost herself in a man she'd known for one rainy night, regardless of how precisely he asked questions or how long the corner of his mouth took to move. She lasted 9 days. It wasn't her fault or it was entirely her fault, depending on how you calculated these things. Her mother called to say she'd been discharged and was resting at the estate for another week per doctor's orders, and that Elias had insisted, and that there was a folder on the kitchen counter with something in it that Delilah needed to see. Her mother's voice was carefully neutral in the way of a woman trying very hard not to sound like she was engineering something. Delilah came back on a Thursday. The folder contained a single document, a referral letter written on personal stationery in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular, addressed to the managing partner of one of the 3 most prestigious civil rights law firms in Washington, D.C. It described a third-year law student of exceptional analytical ability and moral clarity. Those exact words, moral clarity, and recommended her without reservation for their summer fellowship. The fellowship that paid. The one she'd looked at online at 2 a.m. 3 times and talked herself out of applying for, because who was she to think she could get that? The letter was signed Elias Mercer. She stood in that kitchen for a long time. Long enough that the light through the window shifted. Long enough to feel every complicated thing the letter made her feel. Gratitude and pride, and something stubborn that pushed back against both, the old reflex of a woman raised to need nothing from anyone, especially not from men who could afford to give everything. She found him in the garden. He was on a call, pacing along a stone path between hedgerows, and he saw her coming and finished the call without ceremony. He looked at the folder in her hand and waited. "You should have asked me first," she said. "You would have said no. That's not the point, isn't it?" He wasn't defensive. He was simply steady in a way she was beginning to understand was just how he existed in the world, utterly, infuriatingly calm. "You're qualified. You're more than qualified. The only thing standing between you and that fellowship was the assumption that you didn't deserve to want it." The words landed somewhere unguarded. She held the folder tighter. "You don't know me well enough to make that call." "No," he said, "but your mother does. And she's been watching you shrink for 2 years to make yourself easier to carry." A pause. I thought someone should say something. She wanted to be angry. She'd walked out here intending to be. But standing in the pale October light with the letter in her hand and his eyes steady on her face, she felt the anger dissolve into something more honest and more frightening. She felt seen. Completely, inconveniently, dangerously seen. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that says the answer is something the speaker hasn't entirely decided to say yet. Then, "I think you already know why." She did. That was the problem. She had known since the coffee at 6 in the morning. Maybe since the kitchen the first night. Maybe since he said it matters like it was the simplest true thing in the world. She looked down at the letter, then back up at him. "If I apply and I get it, I'm in Washington all summer." "I know. That's 6 months." "I know," he said again. And something in the way he said it, patient, certain, like a man who had already decided to wait, made her breath catch in a way she couldn't quite control. She didn't say anything else. She looked at him for one long, honest moment in the October garden. Then she turned and walked back inside. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and began drafting her application. She applied that night. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She got the fellowship. Of course she did. Though she didn't let herself believe it until the letter arrived, and even then stood in the hallway of her apartment reading it 3 times while her roommate screamed in the background. She called her mother first. Grace cried, quietly, happily, in the particular way of a woman whose prayers have been answered so completely she doesn't quite know what to do next. She did not call Elias. She told herself that was appropriate, professional. The letter had been a gesture, generous, presumptuous, and entirely characteristic of a man who moved through the world like someone who had decided that the usual rules applied to everyone but him. It didn't mean anything beyond that. She was going to Washington. She was going to build her career. She was going to be exactly who she'd always meant to be. He texted her 3 weeks later. One line, "Congratulations. I heard." And then, after a pause that she could not stop herself from reading into, "Your mother cried for 20 minutes. I made her tea." She laughed out loud in the middle of the Yale Law Library. 2 people turned to look at her. She didn't care. She texted back, "You made tea?" Because it was easier than saying what she actually wanted to say. His response came immediately. "I make excellent tea. I'm full of surprises." She stared at her phone, smiled, put it face down on the table, picked it up again. This was a problem. She saw him twice before she left for Washington. Once when she came to help her mother pack up her things from the estate, once when she arrived to return a set of keys and found him already outside, jacket on, car running, holding a small box that turned out to contain a set of legal reference books she'd mentioned once in passing and clearly forgotten she'd mentioned. He handed them to her without ceremony. She looked at the books and then at him and had the fleeting, terrifying thought that this man had been paying attention to her since the very first night in a way that no one in her life ever quite had. "You're going to do extraordinary things," he said simply. She almost said, "Come with me." She didn't. She said thank you and drove away and spent the first 2 hours of the drive to Washington talking herself out of turning around. The fellowship was everything. The work was real and hard and meaningful, the kind of work she trained for and dreamed about and ached toward for years. She was good at it, genuinely good, which mattered more than she'd expected it to. Her supervising attorney told her at the end of the first month that she had the sharpest instincts for argumentation she'd seen in a decade of mentoring fellows. Delilah carried that compliment carefully, the way you carry something you don't want to drop. She and Elias talked. Not constantly. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with noise, and she discovered she was grateful for that. But regularly, honestly, in the way of 2 people who have quietly, without formal agreement, decided that the other person's voice is something they don't want to live without. He told her things she suspected he didn't tell most people. She told him things she hadn't said out loud before. Her mother stopped pretending not to notice and started asking about him by name. "He's my mother's employer," Delilah told her roommate, who had heard enough phone conversations by then to have formed strong opinions. Her roommate gave her a very specific look. "Sure he is." 4 months in, on a cold February night with snow coming down outside her Washington apartment window, Elias called instead of texting. She answered on the second ring. He said, without preamble, "I'm in D.C." Her heart did something inconvenient. "For business?" "Originally." A pause. "I'd like to see you, if you want that." She looked at the snow. She thought about the October garden, about reference books and tea, and it matters in the corner of his mouth, about all the miles she'd put between herself and that estate, and how none of them had made her think about him any less. "I want that," she said. He took her to a small restaurant in Georgetown that looked like nothing from the outside and felt like everything on the inside. Warm light, quiet music, the kind of place where the tables were far enough apart that conversation stayed private. She wore the green dress her mother had sent as a congratulations gift. He stood when she walked in, which she hadn't expected, and looked at her in a way that made the whole room seem like background. They ordered food they barely ate. They talked like people who have been waiting for months for the particular luxury of a table and eye contact and the absence of distance. She told him about her cases, about the family she'd helped navigate a housing discrimination suit, about the moment in the courtroom when the judge had looked directly at her and she'd felt for the first time entirely, unshakably sure she was in the right place. He listened the way he always listened, fully, with the kind of attention that made you want to keep talking forever. He told her things, too, about the business he'd spent years building and the parts of it he was ready to let go, about a younger brother he'd raised after their mother died and who was now in medical school in Boston, about the specific loneliness of being a man that everyone was slightly afraid of, and how strange it was to be in a room with someone who simply wasn't. "You've never been afraid of me," he said. "Should I be?" He considered her seriously. "Most people think so. Most people," she said, "don't know you." Something moved across his face, quietly, deeply, the way light moves through water. She held his gaze and didn't look away, because she was Grace Carter's daughter, and Grace Carter had raised her to hold her ground, especially in the moments that mattered. Delilah. The way he said her name, careful, deliberate, like it meant something, made her breath go shallow. "I need to say something." "Okay. I spent a long time telling myself that calling you was practical, that staying in touch was about your mother, that bringing the books was," he paused, a wry expression flickering briefly, thoughtful professional courtesy. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "Very convincing. I'm aware it wasn't." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and looked at her with the full force of that dark, precise attention. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with courtesy or practicality, and everything to do with the fact that you are the most honest, most clear-eyed, most genuinely good person I have met in longer than I can remember. And I would like, if you're willing, to stop pretending otherwise." The restaurant was warm. The snow was still falling outside the window. She thought about her mother sitting up in that hospital bed, saying he's not what people say he is. She thought about every conversation, every book, every early morning in a kitchen where something true was quietly being built between two people who both kept trying to call it something else. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I stopped pretending," she said a long time ago. The smile that crossed his face then was the rarest thing, full and unguarded. The smile of a man who had not let himself want something in years and was only now allowing himself to have it. She stored that smile somewhere important. She intended to see it again. They walked along the Potomac afterward, snow dusting their shoulders, talking about nothing consequential. Her favorite case she'd ever studied, his brother's specialty in cardiology, whether Georgetown or New Haven made better pizza, the particular satisfaction of being exactly where you're supposed to be. He held her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was. When he dropped her at her building, she stood on the step and looked up at him and thought about a rainy night in Greenwich and a side gate left unlatched and a man who had filled the doorway and changed the entire direction of her life without either of them meaning for it to happen that way. She thought about her mother in a two-big bed and a referral letter written in angular handwriting and tea, and it matters, and every careful, deliberate thing this man had done to show her who he was before he ever said a word about how he felt. "I got a job offer," she said quietly. It wasn't what she'd meant to lead with, but it was true, and he deserved the truth. He stilled. "Here? In D.C.? The firm wants me full-time after the fellowship." She watched his face. "It's a good offer." He nodded slowly, reading her the way he always did, completely, without rushing. But my mother is in Greenwich." And she stopped. "And other things," he repeated, and the warmth in his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "If I came back," she said carefully, "it wouldn't be for you. I want you to know that. It would be for my career and my mother and my own reasons." "I know," he said, "but it would also be partly for you." "I know that too." She laughed, the real one, the unguarded one, and he looked at her like she'd given him something irreplaceable. Maybe she had. Maybe they'd been giving each other things for months without properly accounting for it. That was all right. Some debts were worth keeping. Grace Carter was waiting up when Delilah called that night. Of course she was. She answered on the first ring with a silence that meant she'd been sitting by the phone for an hour. "Mama," Delilah said, "I think I'm coming home." Grace exhaled, long and slow and deep, like a woman setting down something she'd been holding for a very long time. "Baby," she said softly, "I think you already are." Months later, in the garden of the Greenwich estate, on an evening in late spring, when the hedgerows were green and the light was gold, and her mother was laughing with the housekeeper near the kitchen door, Elias found Delilah sitting on the stone bench with a case file open in her lap. He sat beside her without asking, the way he'd long since stopped needing to. She leaned into him just slightly, just naturally, and kept reading. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The garden was warm, and her mother was laughing, and the file in her lap held the names of the family she was going to help. And everything felt exactly right. Some stories don't begin with grand declarations. Some begin with a side gate left unlatched, and a daughter who loved her mother too much to stay away, and a man who looked at her in a kitchen doorway and decided, quietly, permanently, without fanfare, that she was worth every change he was about to make. That's the thing about love that finds you when you're not looking. It doesn't knock. It just walks in through the side door, and it stays. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, because their story isn't over yet.